Welcome to the Climate Action Voices podcast. Our mission is simple: to explore the most effective, actionable pathways to build resilience for communities and individuals against the escalating threats of climate change. In this episode, we dive into the systems and solutions that make climate resilience, adaptation, and scaling possible. Please like and share this podcast. In today's episode, we'll talk about what it takes to actually move climate-smart innovation from a successful pilot to something that genuinely changes food systems at scale. Across Africa, climate shocks are intensifying, farmers are absorbing more risk, and the pressure is growing to turn good science into solutions that last. We'll draw lessons and identify strategies from the accelerating impacts of CGR Climate Research for Africa AICCRA, which has spent the past few years testing what works, building partnerships, and helping climate-smart services and innovations reach roughly 12 million people. I'm your host, Nzuki Esther, and I'm joined by two guests from the Alliance of Bioversity International and CIAT. We have Dr. Robert Zougmoré, who is the AICCRA Director and has led the project across countries and themes, helping turn a complex multi-country initiative into a practical platform for delivery. We also have Hanna Ewell, who coordinates scaling work across 6 AICCRA countries, with a focus on responsible scaling and how to spread innovation without creating new risks or leaving vulnerable groups behind. Now to start us off, Robert, being the director of AICCRA, how did you find yourself in this space?
I have been the director of this project for the last 2 years, and I think it has been a very exciting experience for me as a researcher, especially in view of the achieved outcome and impact. And I believe also that through this project, it is really rewarding to see the partnership that has been developed over the years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we've mentioned AICCRA. There's someone who is listening to this episode and it's the first time to hear about this project. Probably you can give us an overview of what AICCRA is and what was its intent purpose.
So in a nutshell, AICCRA is what we usually call a scaling project. But behind this word scaling, actually it's more about trying to leverage the sort of existing innovations and technologies that have been evidenced from the various CGIAT centers for the last 50 years to ensure that, we can partner with a number of actors at different levels, from the continental to the regional and to the country level, to make sure that this innovation can reach the last mile, as we used to say. So AICCRA is basically a research for development project through which we leverage existing evidence-based innovation to develop new partnership, new framework for scaling in order to reach the last mile in Africa.
Thank you, Robert, for that overview. And now coming to Hanna, you coordinate the scaling work across 6 Africa countries. Maybe you can tell us, today we'll be talking about how to scale these solutions, these innovations that Robert just mentioned. When we mention the word scaling, most times we think about the increase in numbers. So that's when we delve deeper now, we'll be able now to understand all these aspects of scaling that we are talking about and how they link to the climate smart innovations. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. As you just mentioned, I think scaling, it's itself a complex concept, and many researchers, so it's certainly also not something new, but as Robert also mentioned, it's more like a process of really shifting evidence-based innovations to the last mile, and what that looks like can have multiple pathways, or that can look quite different depending on context. And so the most traditional definition of scaling is scaling out, which is really about kind of reaching more people, more geographies over time. But there's also multiple other ways that we can understand scaling. So for example, one of the mechanisms Robert mentioned is partnerships. And one of the ways that you can actually scale is by very intentionally embedding innovation processes, so not just the innovations themselves, but even things like partnership models or kind of dissemination strategies, such as even digital means or more traditional farmer-oriented approaches such as demonstration plots and farmer field schools and things that CIAT has worked on, that such as climate smart villages and other participatory approaches. Those can be embedded within institutions as strategies, and that's scaling up. And then there's a third way to understand scaling, which is more about really changing the structures or even the norms around how an innovation is used, and that can be defined as scaling deep. So those are just 3 ways of understanding scaling, and there's many, many other ways. There's also ways to see scaling as kind of multiple use cases. So the same type of innovation can nevertheless be applied in different ways in new contexts. And so that itself is a different form of scaling. And within the program, with the support of also an external consultant and multiple iterations with the country teams, we also developed a scaling framework that actually is understanding scaling along 3 different pathways: technical excellence, demand and investment, and sustained use. And this really positions scaling as more from the systems perspective, because it really makes clear that we have to understand that you can have technical excellence, and we should have technical excellence, the evidence base, for example, but that alone is not sufficient. You really have to have an innovation or even a package of innovations. That means that you're combining different innovations together, such as climate smart agriculture and climate information services in the case of AICCRA. But those have to have sufficient demand. So you have to really understand the context, and you have to be working with farmers, but also policymakers and investment. So that has to really be something that there's a case for from the private sector or also from governments. And lastly, you have to make sure that it's really reaching or able to reach the last mile by facilitating the conditions for uptake. So that can be things like market systems, seed systems that actually enable sustained use over time.
Mm-hmm. So in today's episode, based on what Robert and even Hanna have spoken, it has just given us a glimpse of the discussion that we're going to have, because we're going to talk about how these innovations can be scaled and how they can be embedded in systems so that they survive beyond a single project cycle. And so, to Robert, before we get into a much deeper into scaling, maybe you can help us to locate the AICCRA project in time. We know it has been operational for about 5 years, but now we're also building up on CCAFs, which was there before. So where would you say this project stands today, and what is the real story for this moment?
Thank you. So actually, AICCRA started in 2021 as what we call a baby of the previous CCAFs program, the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Program. We had an initial phase of 3 years through which we actually focus more on making sure that all these innovations and technologies that we are aiming to scale through the mechanism presented by Hanna can reach the farmers. So basically, we focus more on the access, right? Mm-hmm. And through the 3 years, we were able to ensure that at least about 5 million farmers got access to climate information services and to climate smart agriculture innovation. And then the second phase that we call the additional financing phase was a 2 years period through which we learn from the first phase to now focus more on making sure that if they access, how they can effectively use these innovations and technologies to impact their resilience, to impact their livelihoods, to impact their daily life, I would say. And so from 21 to 2025, you can realize that we have progress over time, but we have also progress technically and also about the vision of a project, moving from just sharing knowledge and information to those beneficiaries to ensure that they can effectively use them through the number of mechanisms that Hanna has explained. But I would like to also mention that over these years, we've learned a lot of lessons about how to make a project sort of very impactful in the ground. And there are some values like, being very inclusive of all the partners, considering a demand-driven approach, whereby we start with what context-specific needs are described in the different intervention countries, and then design the appropriate, tailored impact pathway that will really help to scale, including it can combine the different options that Hanna mentioned, can be just dissemination, can be using tools like the climate smart villages, participatory action research, but also investment schemes like business models, or using also policy influence to go to scale. And all those have helped over the 5 years to reach about 7 million beneficiaries. And when I say beneficiaries, it includes both farmers, extensionists, university, academia, agents, and many more.
Well, that's a good progress from access now to adoption. So, based on what you said, what are you most proud of? Not just in outputs, but in what changed on the ground. Maybe you can give us an example. You've given us many examples, but what really stood out for you that you are most proud of?
That's an interesting question. I would say the most exciting thing from my perspective is when I hear, here and there, partners saying that, this AICCRA project is just a flagship project that is impacting the lives of people. And so it means somewhere that the impactfulness that we are looking for through this project has been really achieved. And I would say this is an exception because most of the time we succeed to generate the knowledge, the scientific evidence, we disseminate things, but then the last mile, the last dot to ensure that the beneficiaries will adopt our innovation effectively and it can impact them positively is something that is most of the time challenging. So getting to hear that from the beneficiaries that they are impacted by this project, it's really rewarding.
Now, just to echo what you said, the impacts, how it has been rewarding. Maybe now I will turn it to Hanna. Robert mentioned about, ensuring these technologies are context specific. And that means that one innovation, it's not deemed that it can work in another area. So when you talk about this innovation, most times organizations, they start from pilots. When you're given the money to start this project, mostly we start from pilots. So to achieve the numbers that Robert just stated and that impact, how can we scale these pilots to ensure that they're sustainable?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think it's not easy. I think we also can't forget that scaling is not easy, and that very often projects get kind of stuck on scale, like stuck on how do I do? This is my goal, but how do I do this? And also that you get a bit used to pilots, you get used to these controlled conditions with a set amount of financing and your partnerships are in place and everyone has their roles and responsibilities versus when you're scaling, you lose some of that control because as much as I very much agree with what Robert said, that we have to have very tailored and intentional mechanisms to be context specific and inclusive, and really I can't forget that either. We also have a lot of conditions in the enabling environment that may or may not support the scaling of our innovation. So being cognizant of that and really trying to facilitate at the very least, influencing the enabling environment. And that's what we really do by having strong partnerships, by understanding the business models. And that's what I think also is unique about AICCRA as a scaling project compared to many maybe pilot settings where we really embed within private and public sector engagements rather than remaining in that controlled environment. So we're also very intentionally giving some of that responsibility to partners and seeing how this, especially through larger partnerships with regional bodies, for example, like the East African, Southern African, West African trade organizations such as ECOWAS and CORA. These are really mechanisms where the governments themselves are then able to also adapt. I think that's also what we need to understand, that it might not be the exact same innovation, like you were saying, from place to place, but it might be adapted to fit the context and be more applicable to that environment and that set of conditions.
Listening to what you said, it seems like a process. Now I'm imagining a scenario probably where you have been given funds for about, let's say, 3 years or 2 years. How would you move from pilot to scale, and how would you be able now to determine the change? Because at the end of the day, also the investors, they want to see that change, and sometimes change takes time. So what are the strategies that you can use at that period of time to ensure that the scaling is effective?
So one of the tools that we used also within workshops that we did across countries is called the Scaling Scan. And it's just one of many tools. In particular, this really tries to unpack what they call the ingredients for scale. So trying to, from a more systemic point of view, trying to have it be a dialogue around what are the different potential bottlenecks that can be faced in the scaling pathway, and what are mechanisms to overcome that. And I think that's a really important thing to do very intentionally, rather than assuming scalability or seeing success from a pilot, which of course people should be proud of, but rather than just assuming that what worked in one situation will be the same. And so really targeting those key bottlenecks and identifying them in the first place, and then finding potential opportunities from those that are really already identified as strong, but then also identifying where the gaps need to be filled and which partners might actually be best placed to do that. Or in certain cases, we might have also, even in successful pilots, potentially and unintentionally further marginalized certain groups of the population or had certain environmental trade-offs emerge. And so then when scaling, and to have really successful impact and in a measurable way, then you want to already use that process of joint agenda setting. So I think that's really something that it shouldn't be ever seen as an imposed or engineered process, but rather something that is really co-defined with the very groups that are going to pursue the scaling process, and identifying these ingredients early in the process, and then also making sure that you're also combining, as a result of identifying those different bottlenecks and enablers, that you're then combining your core innovation, or kind of, for example, an improved drought-resistant variety, that you're saying, okay, well, what are these different elements that actually will make it successful? Are things like having a functioning seed system sector. Even if farmers have been growing this crop in demo sites or in a small scale, but then are faced with conditions like they're not able to access or pay for these seeds because they're not available in a way that's actually accessible to them, then seed companies could do multiple things. They can offer like smaller seed packs, and that can be part of the bundle as this like business model element. Or you could have, we've seen this, for example, in both Zambia and Mali within AICCRA. There was a pay-as-you-go irrigation model that was really successful because farmers were struggling with rain-fed agriculture conditions given increasing climate shocks. And then by combining and bundling a new rice variety with a business model and this irrigation pay-as-you-go system, they're actually able to plant and see successes from these varieties over time. So that's just one example, but the most important thing, because I've said a lot, is to make sure that you're actually doing kind of a context and needs assessment together with stakeholders to have a pathway forward that's joint.
Thank you so much. And it seems, it's like you've addressed almost everything. Now, you mentioned the aspect of bundling. And now this one I'll direct to Robe. I think this is one of the mechanisms that has really worked for AICCRA. What is this bundling? And why is it an important shift in thinking?
I think you said it, Esther. This is one of the innovation of AICCRA. Because as I said before, during the first phase, we were sort of disseminating climate information services on one side and climate smart agriculture technologies on the other one. But then, as Hanna said, through the process, we learn from, the challenges, the needs of the different users. And it appears that it is better if we have some sort of packaging of some of these innovation so that, for instance, climate information service can inform the specific crop or crop variety for a given rainy season in a given country. This is one example of bundling through which climate information can be bundled with a crop variety and then can be also bundled with an information on the itinerary to follow in terms of cropping system, plus also some opportunities like where to find inputs, where to find the crop variety that has been selected for this place. So we bundle all this information, and at the end of a season, another bundling can be, for instance, to find out where is the most appropriate market after the harvest. Harvesting can be also impacted by the climate. The last rains can also destroy sometime, the harvest. So getting to know, for instance, the most appropriate dates of harvesting can help the farmers to avoid losing the only 1 year rainy season product. And then they get the information through the bundling about the best opportunistic market around the village. And then this helps them to then sell their product and be able to generate some funding that will support their livelihood. So we have tried to be tactical in this bundling process. Of course, as Hanna said, through following the demand-driven process of the beneficiaries.
As a follow-up on that, when you talk about the issue of bundling, we're also talking about these agent networks. We're also talking about, addressing the entire agribusiness space. But we can't do this without money. Now about the climate and finance aspect. How can we make these investments? We're talking about the bundling. You've mentioned the drought resistant seed, climate information services, how we are connecting all this to ensure the farmer benefits. So how are we going to make these investments that we are aiming bankable so that we can harness even the climate finance from both the public and the private sector?
That's a very important question because you are touching here on the investment ecosystem that goes hand to hand with agriculture promotion. And you know that when it goes to funding, then it requires some concrete actions that will lead to yielding benefit at the end of the process and involving the private sector in particular. So what we try to do under AICCRA is, first of all, to provide the evidence of what business model can work. We provide the cost effectiveness of the different models that exist, of course, based on the bundles that have been generated for the different contexts. And then we provide this evidence which allow then the financing actors to come in more confidently about investing, putting their money into accompanying the different farmers and beneficiaries. And then we continue accompanying the process to learn and see if at the end of the process, every contributor to the business model has benefited as expected. And so it's a process through which we actually learn from the different steps along the value chain, I would say, to make sure that both the financial actors, the input dealers, the farmers who are putting their hand in the pocket to buy the input and so on, are confident enough to go for these kind of businesses. Mm-hmm. And this is where the private sector is really crucial, because it helps to ensure sustainability of the scaling models that Hanna has explained. Mm-hmm. Beyond just promoting the evidence-based nature of a different innovation, we have to also demonstrate that these bundles are also speaking to a number of business actors that can adopt them as models to go by themselves, even beyond the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love the way you said you ensure you document everything, and also working with the beneficiaries. So I think that is one aspect of responsible scaling. And now I'm bringing it to Hanna. Yes, we talk about responsible scaling. What does it mean in practice now, just building upon what Robert has been able to highlight?
Yeah, I think similar to scaling itself, responsible scaling can also be understood and practiced in multiple ways. It draws conceptually or academically speaking maybe from responsible innovation literature, and was really intentionally brought into this agriculture research for development context and this science of scaling process, because it's about doing no harm. Basically at the base level, it's aligns also well with what the World Bank has in place for AICCRA as a project as well, which are environmental and social safeguards. And that's a very critical element, I think, as well. But responsible scaling really takes it further to also be part of the process. So it's about, similar to what I was mentioning for kind of that scaling scan tool that helps identify the different conditions for scaling. What's important in responsible scaling is anticipating those risks and then being able to, together with different stakeholders, so really being inclusive in terms of both the end users of how are we ensuring diverse benefit to different groups, but then also how are we, from a process perspective, engaging them and not just assuming them as users, but as involved in defining the scaling process and testing the scaling pathways. And that's partners as well as farmers. And then another element is actually about learning. So what Robert mentioned, and that builds on having the evidence, but it's really about being willing to almost like look in the mirror of the project, and say, well, how can we actually be more reflexive about how we are pursuing the research itself and what hasn't worked well and how can we react to that. So the last element is about responsiveness, and that's building on all the other dimensions. It's really how do we then best redirect in case we find situations of harm or potential trade-offs. How do we redirect a program? This aligns also very well with kind of more adaptive management and adaptive business that I think is quite common also across the private sector, but really building on learnings and being willing also to step away from things that are not working so well, and that's not easy to do. So I think what I've learned so much within AICCRA and with the partners is this incredible openness and flexibility and the spirit around really wanting the scaling outcome and process to be responsible.
Oh. Yeah, that's a perfect example of responsible scaling. And now I'll just go back to Robert. Because of that, we can see from the numbers. ICCRA reached about over 11 million farmers. What did ICCRA get right that other projects often miss?
I believe that one of the innovative reasons for success of AICCRA has been the fact that, one, we have been very inclusive. Second, we have been very participatory in our approaches. Third, as I said, we have been also following the demand-driven kind of approach to develop a portfolio of innovative solutions for climate-smart agriculture and climate information services. And we have also tried to create conditions for better capacity building of all our partners. By capacity building, we also mean taking into account the comparative advantage and not coming, as the big expert that brings, the great science and everything. No, we listen to them, we understand their challenges, we align what we want to do with their institutional agenda, and we just capacitate them with the evidence-based tools, approaches, innovation, including the scaling framework that Anna mentioned, for instance, which has been developed on the basis of what we learn in the ground with them. So it looked like, at the end of the process, they are using a sort of ready-for-use product for which they have contributed from the beginning. And so those are the kind of innovations that make AICCRA very specific. Another innovation from AICCRA is that we have also tried to humbly promote local innovative practices. Not just, what is coming from the research side, but also proven practices from the communities, from the extension partners that have been, empirically developed in the ground. We package all those within the bundling approach, and we ensure that it also speak to the culture of people, to the daily work and daily life. And this is also something that is very sensitive on the social perspective of things. Not to mention, we also consider gender and lens to make sure that we don't forget, our very nice part of the world, the women, in this journey of AICCRA.
Mm-hmm. One thing that you mentioned concerning the ICCRA framework, you said based on the experiences and the evidence that you're able to collect, this is a ready-for-use innovation, that framework. How different is this from other scaling books, and why would you recommend other people, other partners to use this scaling playbook?
Yeah, you're right. That's also, it's going to be an exciting kind of legacy product of ICCRA, and it should certainly be adapted and contextualized. But what we tried to do with that is really use the experience of the 5 years of implementation. So the first phase and then the additional 2 years is that it builds on different examples, and it's really using the model of ICCRA and the experiences together with partners. And I really like what Robert mentioned, that it's also not just about the science-based innovations that might have come from previous programs of the CGIAR, but it's really also about embedding with existing solutions and having also a capacity sharing mechanism in place where the experiences can be built upon and also have very integrated community level action. And what the playbook is it's really meant, as the name implies, is really meant to be almost like a handbook or a guide, and adaptable, as I said, but that it's structured around 7 phases, and it's really trying to be very practical with kind of guiding questions and triggering activities and things like that can be used by different groups. So it can be something that a private sector partner picks up and sees as relevant for their work. It can be something that a government actor wants to apply in their context, and hopefully by providing these examples as well as really practical activities, it can be something that can serve at least as a set of questions and processes that can support the process towards scaling for others as well. So and it includes, a big part of it is it's built around the scaling framework, so it uses that really to guide the different activities, but then it also introduces a series of different tools and approaches that can be used at different stages. For example, specifically for social differentiation and gender inclusion, or specifically for business model development, the business model canvas. So it's really trying to have a more integrated approach.
So for the new AICCRA FSRP 4 phase that has been signed, Robbie, what does that next chapter make possible? How do you feel that chapter will be?
Okay, AICCRA FSRP 4 is, it's seen as a new project, but it definitely leverages the successes of AICCRA 1 and 2. And Hanna just mentioned the playbook as one legacy, but we have other legacy, like for instance, the innovation catalog, that is, synthesizing all the best bet innovation. And this includes a number of categories of innovation. Can be technological innovation, can be tools, can be processes, can be policy-related innovations. So all those have been documented in a practical way to support, the scaling that will take place in the next phase of AICCRA 3. So basically, AICCRA 3 now want to sort of systematize, all the ingredients that have been developed under AICCRA 1 and 2. And one example is, for instance, making sure that the scaling perspective and models that AICCRA 1 and 2 use to be successful will be now systematized at the institutional level through capacitating regional organizations, African regional organizations, so that they are able to do what we CGIAR we were doing during AICCRA 1 and 2. So that's the novelty of AICCRA 3. Another new thing is that in AICCRA 3, one thing is that we want to also focus on the job creation for youth. One thing is to have innovations that are adopted, etc. But then we know that if we don't succeed to make them adopted by the youth, based on, some sort of models of jobs relating to private sector, business models, financial actors, digital-led activities that are of interest for the youth. So we will be focusing on those kind of innovation to ensure that youth will become sort of business entities, enterprises, and will then take advantage of all the innovations. So basically, in a nutshell, AICCRA 1, we've provided evidence of what works, scientifically speaking. We've piloted them with farmers, beneficiaries. We made them accessible. AICCRA 2, we move from access to making sure that these innovations are now used. AICCRA 3, we will now make sure that the different organizations with which we used to work for to ensure the widespread dissemination are now capacitated to now go by their own in a very sustainable manner. Let's also mention the fact that under AICCRA 1 and 2, we have tested what we call the spillover effect, which basically try to leverage success cases from the intervention countries and make sure that it can benefit non-AICCRA countries in the continent. And we have ensured that at least 39 countries in Africa have benefited from the generated AICCRA innovation during the last 5 years. Partnership was very key in ensuring that we have the enabling environment and ecosystem to deploy, and disseminate all the proven innovations. Obviously, the CGIAR as an international organization is not, sometimes going down into what we call the last mile, the farmers in the ground. So we need to work with the partners, and this is where developing partnership is important for us as CGIAR, but it is also an opportunity for us to capacitate these partners, from regional to country level, and ensure that they will take up, our innovation on the best way possible, so that it reduces the challenges and the adverse effect of disseminating, scaling innovation. Because you can scale a technology and it may end up with a reversed negative result expected. So making sure that the partners are really on board and align with, what the CGIAR has recommended is very crucial. And of course, we also want to see the partnership as a way of attracting local other actors, like the private sector in its context, the policy makers that are different from one region or one country to another. So we take advantage of all this, and we make sure that as an international organization, we remain positions where we can ensure we don't compete with other partners. This is important for the partnership. It should be a win-win partnership, as we used to say.
That reminds me of competition.
Exactly. Have you heard of this? I like it so much. So it's basically saying instead of competing, so it builds on what you were mentioning, comparative advantage. Instead of competing with one another, why don't we pursue co-opetition so that we're actually cooperating towards common goals, but having individual responsibilities.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Esther.
Thank you too. Now in 1 second to Hanna. If scaling an innovation was like cooking a meal for thousands of people, what is that one ingredient that most people forget to add, resulting in a project that tastes great but doesn't actually nourish the community?
Wow, you've been asking tough questions, Esther.
Not really.
That one ingredient is hard to answer, but I would say a very critical ingredient, well, apart from, and it relates to partnership, but apart from partnership, is listening. Because I think it relates very well to partnerships in the sense of successful partnerships are built on mutual respect and listening and really being responsive to each other's needs and interests, but also really listening to what communities can already offer. That was mentioned by Robert, like what already exists actually, what can we complement rather than replace. And also just listening to each other as colleagues and sharing with each other about experiences perhaps in other contexts and other community settings, etc. So maybe that's a pretty critical ingredient.
And listening, as you said, leads to respect each other, and then leads to creating trust between you and your partners, which is fundamental, to ensure the adoption of what you are offering.
Trust.
Trust.
For Robert, you've led this work across 6 focus countries. If you're stranded on a remote farm in one of them and could only have one piece of climate smart technology to ensure a harvest, what will it be and why?
Wow.
These are not easy questions.
Wow. One single
Yes.
technology.
Yes.
Wow. We spoke about the bundling, because usually one single technology cannot make it. So I would prioritize, having a bundling of innovations. And one example is, for instance, the accelerators programs in the different countries, where private sector actors have worked with public sector entities to come together around a given package of innovations that support a value chain like maize or yam or cassava, and ensure that all the ingredients are there step by step from the production up to the plate, to ensure that everything goes well, independently of climatic risk, pest and disease, lack of inputs, and so on and so forth. That's the best example.
Indeed, yeah. It's the aspect of bundling. And so I like how you've gone around the question.
In a good way.
Yes, in a good way. You can't scale one innovation. Yeah, so with that, if there's one message that ran through this conversation, was that the future of climate resilience in Africa will not be decided by good ideas alone. And so it will be decided by whether proven ideas can move through systems, policy, partnerships, delivery channels, and local institutions, until they become part of how food systems actually work. And so with that, we want to say thank you to Robert and Hannah, and to our listeners. Until the next episode of Climate Action Voices, have a good day.